James II of Scotland is remembered less for how he ruled than for how he died. His reign was turbulent, violent, ambitious, and it ended in one of the strangest royal deaths in European history. He was blown up by his own cannon. Let's begin with the man himself. James was born in 1430, the son of James I and Joan Beaufort. His father had tried to impose strong royal authority after years of noble domination, but in 1437 he was assassinated in Perth. James was only 6. From the very beginning, his childhood was shaped by violence and instability. The regency that followed was dominated by rival noble factions. Scottish politics at the time was almost feudal. Great magnates like the Black Douglases, the Livingstons, and the Crichtons had their own castles, their own private armies, and their own ambitions. The young king was a prize to be controlled. At times, James was even moved around the country like a pawn in their power struggles. By the 1440s, as he entered his teenage years, James began to push back. His reign is most often defined by his war against the Black Douglases, the most powerful noble family in Scotland. The Douglases were almost a state within a state, with vast estates in the borders and the southwest. At their height, they controlled nearly a third of the kingdom. To James, they were an intolerable rival. The clash came to a head in 1452. James invited the 8th Earl of Douglas to Stirling under a safe conduct, only to have him stabbed to death during a private audience. It was a shocking act, but James justified it as necessary for the crown's survival. War followed, and in 1455 the Douglases were decisively crushed at the Battle of Arkenholm. Their lands were forfeited, their power broken. James had reasserted royal authority in a way none of his immediate predecessors had managed. With the Douglases destroyed, James could finally look outward. South of the border, England was descending into chaos, the Wars of the Roses, Lancaster and York tearing each other apart. For Scotland, this was an opportunity. James launched a series of raids: Berwick in 1455, the Isle of Man in 1456, Northumberland in 1457. These were not great victories. They were plunder, disruption, truces, nothing that could be celebrated as a lasting triumph. And James wanted triumph. He wanted something bold, something unmistakable. One passion of his would offer him that chance and destroy him. James was obsessed with artillery. Cannons were the future of war. The great medieval castles, built to withstand swords and arrows, were suddenly vulnerable. A well-placed bombard could tear down walls that had stood for centuries. Across Europe, kings were seizing on this new technology. The French had used artillery to devastating effect against the English in Normandy. The Ottomans had used massive bombards to breach the walls of Constantinople in 1453. James was determined that Scotland should not be left behind. He imported guns from Flanders, from France. He lavished money on smiths and gun founders. He loved to watch the weapons fire, and he loved to stand close to them. That detail would matter. In July 1460, James brought his army to Roxburgh Castle. Roxburgh was no ordinary target. It was one of the 4 great castles of the borders, along with Berwick, Jedburgh, and Kelso. For 2 centuries, it had been a flashpoint between Scotland and England, captured and recaptured again and again. Whoever held Roxburgh controlled the Tweed Valley. For the Scots, it was both a fortress and a symbol of English intrusion into their lands. To take Roxburgh would be to avenge generations of loss. It would also give James the kind of victory he craved, grand, unmistakable, written into the history books. By late July, the siege was underway. James brought with him his great bombards, vast wrought-iron guns made of long staves of iron bound together with hoops. They were clumsy, they were dangerous, and they were unpredictable. But when they worked, they were terrifying. On the 3rd of August, 1460, James was standing beside one of these great cannons. It was not being fired at the castle. It was being fired in salute to mark the arrival of his Queen Mary of Guelders, whom James had invited to witness his victory. The gun exploded. On the force of the blast shattered the bombard. A huge shard of iron tore into James's thigh, snapping the bone clean in two. Accounts written later say he was struck down instantly. His artery would have been severed, the blood loss catastrophic. In an age for even the most basic surgical techniques, it was hopeless. He would have died in minutes, perhaps even seconds. Robert Lindsay of Pitscottsea, writing a century later, simply records that the king was stricken to the ground and died hastily. The scene must have been chaos. The king cut down in the mud by his own gun, his attendants screaming, soldiers shouting, arguing, unable to comprehend what had happened. A monarch was supposed to be chosen by God, protected by divine right. Yet here was their king killed in the most random, undignified fashion imaginable, not by sword or arrow or treason, but by the very weapon he had placed his hopes in. The cannon had not even been aimed at the enemy. It had been fired as a salute, a gesture of triumph, of confidence, transformed in an instant into tragedy. And what of Mary of Guelders, the queen who had just arrived? She was only about 20 years old, a woman far from her native Netherlands, suddenly confronted with her husband's bloody corpse and an army stunned into leaderless despair. Yet she rose to the moment. Mary urged the troops to continue. Within 5 days, Roxburgh Castle had fallen. Only then could the mourning begin. Only then was James taken to Edinburgh to be buried in Holyrood Abbey, the traditional resting place of Scottish kings. Roxburgh itself was razed so it could never again serve the English. Today, only fragments remain, and local tradition claims a holly tree near the Tweed marks the very spot where James fell. So what do we take from this? On one level, it is the story of reckless confidence. James believed artillery would be his route to glory, and his curiosity to see the great guns up close cost him everything. On another level, it is a reminder of history's sheer chaos. Kings are not invincible. Power is fragile. Life is fragile. In a single instant, the future of a kingdom can shift. And yet from this disaster came resilience. Mary of Guelders entered the siege as decoration, as pageantry. She left it as a leader, carrying forward the war effort until her own death just a few years later. James II of Scotland is remembered less for his reign than for his end. But in that end, messy, chaotic, absurd, we glimpse the truth of history. It is not neat. It is not inevitable. It is full of ironies, accidents, tragedies. And in August 1460, at Roxburgh, it delivered one of the strangest deaths of any European king. Let us know what other forgotten stories from history you'd like us to explore next.